Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. My name is Brenda Miller. I am an extension educator here in central Minnesota. Todd County is my home base, and I concentrate on livestock production systems. Other teammates we have are Troy Salzer. Troy is up in St. Louis County, Minnesota. Travis Hoffman is our sheep specialist for both the U of M extension and NDSU, North Dakota State extension. And then we have Sabrina Florentino. Sabrina is our small ruminant alternative livestock person, and she is joining us by on campus, so in the cities. And our speaker tonight is Jonathan Kilpatrick. He is the Farmer Education Director for Minnesota's chapter of the Sustainable Farming Association. He's located here in central Minnesota, west central Minnesota, close enough. And he has lots of experience. He's done grazing in different parts of the United States. He has his own little farm there, and he will be sharing some things that we're going to talk about soil health regarding the drought, because here in Minnesota it's been pretty dry the last couple summers. And so Jonathan's going to share some of his wisdom and tell us how soil health can go hand in hand with different grazing strategies. So Jonathan, I know you have some other introductory slides, so I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Brenda. Just making sure I'm going to share my screen here. Just making sure that my audio is coming through for everyone. Does that sound good, Brenda? Can you hear me?
Yep, looks good, and I can see your screen just fine.
Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Like Brenda said, I'm Jonathan Kilpatrick. I'm from the Sustainable Farming Association. I live in Alexandria, Minnesota. And tonight we are going to talk about drought and ways we can thrive through a drought, which isn't typical what you're going to hear those two words together when associated with drought. But I think there's ways and strategies that we can do well, manage well through drought, and also thrive. So I was joking with Brenda earlier that the way to get a good rainstorm is to prepare a PowerPoint on drought, and that's indeed what we did. Got a whole bunch of rain in our area. I think most of Minnesota did get pretty well drenched with some rain this weekend, so that's a good thing. But yeah, so this drought topic, we've here in Minnesota experienced 3 years of pretty much nonstop drought, with 2021 being the worst, and many of you remember that very vividly. And you're wondering, like, what can I do? What are some ways to prepare differently? What are some things we can do so that, we don't always have control over what comes as far as the weather patterns, but what are some ways we can manage differently our operations? So that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to do a little, it's a little bit of my background. This is me at 12 or 13 years old. I started out with my first flock of goats, milk dairy goats, and I've basically been raising livestock ever since. I had the opportunity and privilege to intern and apprentice at Polyface Farms in Virginia's beautiful Shenandoah Valley with the Salatin family. And there I refined and honed my grass farming skills. And then after that, had several different management gigs before coming to SFA. My last gig was in, or I shouldn't say gig, job was in Oklahoma, where I managed a pretty large ranch, about 760 acres. And we did grass-fed beef, grass-finished lamb, and did a lot of retail. So that was what I did right before coming to work for SFA a couple years ago. So this is me and some of the livestock there in Oklahoma. But interesting enough, in Oklahoma, we would get days where you have, multiple, triple digit temperature days. So I always joke that, you're never more than a week or two away from a drought. And part of that is just because of the temperatures. You would get moisture, but you would also lose it very, very quickly because of the extreme heat. And so I learned how to manage grass in a way that even when we did have extended, prolonged periods of dryness, we were always still grazing when the neighbors were feeding hay. And I think that's a key indicator you're doing something right, is when the neighbors who are operating more conventionally are feeding hay and you're still grazing grass at a much lower cost than feeding that hay, you're doing something right. And so the Oklahoma experience was good because it really taught me a lot about drought and a lot about management of grass. So this is the drought map, which I'm sure will change if anybody pays attention to the drought monitor. I'm sure this will change after some of the rain, but I'm here in Douglas County on the edge of the yellow. So even in early spring, we didn't get much snow. We're still very much in a drought. So a couple questions as we get started is what defines a drought? And I don't really have good answers. These are just more thought-provoking, like conversation starters. And the next question is a drought normal? So a lot of times, it's, I hear people say, oh, it's drought. What do I do? And I, the longer you're in the livestock business, it's kind of like that joke that if you have livestock, sooner or later, you're also going to have dead stock. It's kind of a funny farmer rancher joke, but also it kind of applies to drought. If you're in the farming and ranching business,
Right.
sooner or later, you're going to encounter drought or lack of precipitation. And so learning how to manage around that and being proactive is key. Another question is, does our management before a drought affect our ability to come through a drought? And I firmly believe it does. I believe there's a lot of investments into grazing and your soil, particularly, that can really help mitigate these drier times we've been experiencing. And then when should you start to prepare for a drought? And the answer is right now, before you get to a drought. You can always be actively preparing and managing so that when the drought does come again, you're ready and you're prepared. So how do we mitigate the effects of a drought? Just a couple thoughts. I would like to say proactive versus a reactive approach. Too often I see a lot of clients I work with, it's more of a reactive, like you react to what's happening rather than being proactive and realizing this is going to come and hit me at some point. Let's be ready for it. It's not an if mindset, it's a when mindset. It's when a drought is going to hit you, not if it's going to hit you. And a plan, especially a plan. And I love this quote. I've used this a lot, this Eisenhower quote about preparing for battle. Plans tend to be useless, but the planning is indispensable. And I think that it is very valuable to spend some time planning for drought. And as we all know, there's a lot of variability, and when a drought does come, sometimes the plans get thrown out. But the time you spend planning for a drought will really pay off, I think. So the key, I think, to drought management is really just moisture management. We are just managing moisture. We're working to infiltrate and to hold every drop of rain we receive. And then we're also trying to keep our soil moisture losses to a minimum. So I want to talk a bit about soil health. And I know soil health, I think in grazing circles, isn't talked about a ton. It tends to get more focus in the crop farming, in the grain and the cropping circles. But I think as grazers, whether we're growing corn or we're growing grass, paying attention to the soil health is very, very key. So these are the 6 soil health principles. We'll just do a little review. I think everybody's pretty familiar with these. Soil cover is the armor on the soil. Limit the disturbance, either mechanical or chemical. As grazers, we're doing a pretty good job of that. I mean, we don't really tend to. We might rip up a piece or burn down a piece to put a new species in, but we don't tend to really do too badly with that number, the principle 2 there. Build diversity, so that whether that's plants or microbes, livestock, wildlife, work to build diversity on your farm or ranch. Keep a living root in the soil as much as possible. Integrate livestock. That kind of ties back to that diversity principle in the context. Make sure you understand the context of your operation, how these fit appropriately. So I'm going to focus on 2 of these tonight as we're talking about a little bit of soil health for grazing people, the living root and the armor piece. So this is pretty basic. The photosynthesis, solar energy, you're capturing, plant leaves are capturing and cycling solar energy into the soil by the roots, living plants. And then second, we have that is feeding underground biological communities. And we'll kind of touch on a little bit of that later and the importance of that. Biological communities extract nutrients from the soil for the plants. The living plant is a key. So without the living plant, we don't have these biological communities. We don't have soil fungi. We don't have the ability to build soil aggregation, which is the pore space for water infiltration and storage. Aggregates both hold moisture and they also allow space for moisture to travel through the soil profile. So those are 2 very important functions of the soil aggregate when we're talking about water. There's many more, but those are just two I'm focusing on tonight. So without living roots, none of the above is going to happen. So keeping that living plant is crucial. And of course, in a drought, that's everybody's question. Like, how do I keep without irrigation and unlimited supplies of water and resources to apply irrigation or water? Do we have that ability? And the answer is it's difficult. So it's not easy. But that is a crucial part of the soil health piece, is that living root. I'm going to dive a little deeper into that. So you probably saw this. This is just an overview basic of photosynthesis, right? Solar energy, carbon dioxide, and water. We're feeding the plants or the biological communities carbohydrates in the form of sugars. And we're also producing oxygen because of that awesome process. So this is a microscopic view of what we call liquid sun. So this is the tip of a root, and I don't know how many times this is. This might be about 200 times magnification or something like that. This is a root leaking exudate. So this is that liquid sun, that's that solar energy that the plant is taking in through the leaves, and it's leaking it down into the soil profile to feed the biological communities. And so one of those biological communities I want to talk about tonight specifically, this is just one, but I'm just picking mycorrhizal fungi to focus on tonight because I think it's really cool how it relates to water nutrients for the plant. So mycorrhizal fungus, it basically means fungus root. They live in the soil and they connect with living plant roots to supply a great deal of water and nutrients to those plants. They are very, very sensitive to soil disturbance. So if you disturb your soil yearly, like you see in a lot of very intensive till situations, you're going to have very little to zero mycorrhizal fungus. It has to have a non-disturbed place to live. And the key thing is they rely on a living plant. They have to have that living plant because of those carbohydrates leaking from the sun coming through the leaves to feed them and to keep them growing and going. So importance of mycorrhizal fungi is the easiest source of food for soil microbes is the sugar from plant exudates or the root exudates of living plants. So the important thing about the fungi is it produces the biotic glues. So biotic glues is what holds a soil aggregate together. I'm going to get to a little bit more on soil aggregates in a minute. But if you don't have that mycorrhizal fungi, you don't have the plant, or you don't have those biotic glues that are holding soil aggregates together. And remember that soil aggregate actually holds, it stores water and moisture to be released, and also provides a pathway for oxygen and water to move through the soil profile, which is very, very important. And so when I do this, if I talk about this in a live setting with an audience, I like to have someone come up to the front of the room at this point, because mycorrhizal fungi plus roots can explore 20 times the volume of soil compared to plant roots alone. So the person I call up to the front of the room, they are just the roots. And then if there's enough people, I have 21 more people come up to the front of the room. So that's the difference between just plant roots alone on average and the ability of mycorrhizal fungi, and how much more volume of the soil profile that the plant has access to. And that's both nutrients for the plant, and that's also water, which is a very, very key nutrient. So if that alone is to me is mind-blowing, just the importance of how much more of the soil profile you can get with this mycorrhizal fungi, and why I think it is so important for being drought proof and being resistant to drought. Because if you don't have that fungi, you're limiting yourself the amount of water that plant can access in the soil. So it's fascinating stuff to me. So a little bit on soil aggregate. Obviously, it's poor space. You cannot have aggregates, and you'll see a picture there on the right-hand side of some healthy soil, clumps of soil around some plant roots there, but you cannot have those aggregates without that living plant. And the other thing to remember is that after about 28 days, those biotic glues that are produced with the mycorrhizal fungi, those break down. Those start breaking down. So that's why keeping that living root in the soil is so important, because you constantly have to be rebuilding aggregates as those biotic glues deteriorate. So I would encourage grazers to be intentional about checking for soil aggregation. This is something you can do with this tool as simple as a shovel. Flip over some soil, check your aggregation, track your aggregation as your soil health improves. Also, check your infiltration rates. You can see on the right-hand side is a picture of me doing a ring infiltrometer. Very simple ring and some water, and you can time it, see how fast the water infiltrates into the soil profile. And you can track that as hopefully your pastures and your fields are gaining ground in soil health. So a little bit on enhancing the mycorrhizal fungi habitat. Diversity is key. C4 grasses, your warm season grasses, are better, providing habitat and that symbiotic relationship for the fungi than C3 grasses or your cool season grasses. Some woody and brushy species are also good. A lot of folks, want to get rid of every piece of brush out of their pastures, and I understand, but I also think that keeping some in some areas can really help enhancing that mycorrhizal fungi habitat. Graze more mature forage. I think this is really a key, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. There's a picture here of some dairy cattle, actually, from a friend of mine. And I know we're talking about sheep and goats tonight, so you have to forgive me for having some cattle pictures in my presentation, but some of these pictures illustrated the points better. So yeah, you have some dairy cattle, as you can see, grazing some very mature forage. And one of the things on soil health, and so I like to say that carbon is the currency of the soil. So carbon really drives that system in the soil. And one of the keys that I've noticed is this thing called the carbon nitrogen ratio of plant material. So I like to illustrate it this way. If you have a garden and you're going to mulch your garden, you can either mulch it. Let's just say you have grass clippings or you have straw. So which is going to decompose quicker? Typically, your grass clippings are going to decompose quicker than the straw. Well, and the reason being is that grass clippings, I think, are about like a 40-to-1 or a 32-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio. So for every carbon molecule is one molecule of nitrogen or ratio there. And straw is like a 72, depending on what species, a small grain, to 80-to-1. So it's going to decompose. It has to go find nitrogen to decompose. Well, the same thing for grass. And if you clip a lot, or if you keep your grass in a very vegetative state, it's going to decompose much faster. So you're going to have a higher bacterial ratio as opposed to a fungal ratio in your soil. And your armor, so we're going to talk about armor here in a little bit, but your armor will decompose, and you want to keep a lot of armor. So by grazing more mature forage, you're doing a couple of things. You're keeping your soil armored for longer, and you're also producing a lot more carbon for the system. So you really have to feed those soil microbes. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's one key, I think, to really growing soil health is pumping carbon back into the soil, and you're going to do that a lot better by grazing some more mature forage. Another thing is do not disturb the soil. I think we already mentioned that a little bit earlier. And stop using sides. Many are detrimental. So pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, very detrimental to our friends in the soil. So I mentioned we're going to talk about soil cover. So this is one of the other principles of soil health. So obviously covered soil significantly reduces the wind and water erosion and loss of topsoil. And it also helps with the evaporation of soil moisture, because it's one thing to get the water into the soil through the aggregation and infiltration, but once you've got it in there, you don't want to lose it. So by keeping your soil covered, by keeping it armored, you're going to do a much better job at holding the moisture that you get once you do get it. It also helps to insulate and protects the soil biology from extreme temperature fluctuations. So it's just like insulation in a house. You want to insulate and keep that soil biology from extreme temperature fluctuations and from getting too hot and too cold. Nature detests bare ground, and if you just let a piece of ground, if that nature take its course on a piece of ground, you will absolutely see it just start to get covered over with different species. So healthy ecosystems keep their soil covered. So here's an example, real life example. I was on a farm. It was actually about this time of year. It was early May. 65-degree air temperature in early May. And this bare soil was 108 degrees. You can see it was a gopher mound. And I was just getting some soil surface temperatures for fun. And I was kind of blown away at how warm this soil could be, even though it was only 65-degree day in early May. So the optimum soil temperature for biology and for mycorrhizal fungi, which we just talked about, is between 68 and 72 degrees. They're a lot like us people. They like pretty comfortable, comfy conditions. And at that temperature, interestingly enough, 100% of your soil moisture is available. When you get up to 100 degrees, you're losing a lot of your moisture. 85% is lost to evaporation, only 15% available. 130 degrees, your biology is starting to die. You've lost all your moisture, and it's not good for aggregates. Remember, moisture and aggregation, plant biology, all links to building those aggregates. 140 degrees, the biology is severely affected and may take a very long time to recover. So the reason this is important is, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but so the biology and a lot of the little critters in our soil, they're subaquatic organisms, which means they rely on films of water to move around and do their job in the soil. And so if we don't have moisture, one of the reasons in a drought that things slow down and stop growing is yes, moisture, but what drives the whole system is this biological community that does the work of getting the nutrients for the plant. So the more moisture we can keep in the soil, the longer we can keep our grass or our crop growing, because we keep that biology working, getting the nutrients, doing all the work that they do. Sometimes unseen and unappreciated by us. So that's a key. Remember, biology, subaquatic organism, they need that moisture to do their job. Otherwise, they'll just go into hibernation and stop. So this is the same day, just a few feet away from that gopher mound. You can see the soil surface temperature is 66.8 degrees with just a little grass. So here on the bare dirt, 108, 66 degrees, just a few, and that's not even very tall grass. So that just shows you how much just even a little cover can help. So yeah, moving on. Here's another scene that's seen far too often around here is snow with dirt mixed in with topsoil, snert. So interestingly enough, a little backstory, this field that you see at the top of this picture on the right hand side is just a cornfield, no cover, just stalks. And then this is a perennial pasture in the foreground. And the guy with the perennial pasture where I'm standing taking the picture, he caught all this topsoil from his neighbor. So he was buying more farm that way just by stealing his neighbor's topsoil by having a nice perennial pasture there. So I don't know if I really probably need to show these pictures, but this is Kansas in 1935 in the Dust Bowl. This is South Dakota, spring of 2022. The dangers of not keeping soil covered. I probably don't need to say this too much to a grazing group because this is what we already do, but just kind of a reminder of what happens when we don't keep our soil covered and protect it. So let's move into talking a little bit more about grazing. So we talked about the soil health. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the grazing. So anybody want to take a guess? We grab a drink of water here. Anyone want to take a guess what the number one grazing mistake that I think people make? So in my mind, it is not providing adequate pasture rest or recovery. And I like to call it recovery because I'll illustrate it this way. If you go to the gym and you do a workout and you come home, get cleaned up, you jump on the couch and you're gonna take a nap for a little bit. You nap for 2 hours, you take a rest and you get up. How likely are you to want to go back to the gym and just do that same workout? Not very likely. You're going to take your time and recover before you go to your next workout. So grazing is a workout for the plants. It's an acute disturbance. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but it's an acute disturbance to the plants. And a lot of times we talk about periods between grazing intervals as rest periods. And while that is true, I like to frame it a little bit differently as recovery, because what we really want to see before we come back and graze the plant is we want to see it fully recovered and ready for another grazing event. Because if we just set a predetermined rest period, depending on the variability of moisture and other factors, that plant may not be ready for grazing. So I like to frame it as recovery. So that grazing mistake leads to the second most common mistake, which is overgrazing. So overgrazing is one of the things that you'll chronically see in a drought. And for a number of reasons, but I'm going to talk a little bit about overgrazing because it's what you'll see so much in a drought. So overgrazing is more defined as a function of time, and it's not having too many livestock. A lot of people think, well, it's overgrazed because there's too many livestock, and yes, that's part of it, but it's really more the amount of time that group of livestock spent in a particular pasture versus the number of livestock, because you can overgraze something if you stay too long and you just get that second bite. So that's what we're talking about in this next bullet point here. Plant has been grazed again before regrowth occurs. So rebuilding the roots and leaves. So what happens is when that plant has been bitten, it sends signals down to the roots and it says, hey, we've had a disturbance here. We need to start regrowing. And the root system of the plant also acts as a warehouse. Okay, so that it leaks some of that solar energy out to the biology, but it also stores some for when there's a period of stress, like a grazing event. So it starts to regrow. And also depending on how much leaf is left on the plant will dictate how much more solar energy it can take in and how much it has to pull from the roots. So if the livestock come back and take a second bite a couple days later when the plant has started to regrow, it's going to require that plant to pull more energy out of the roots. And if that happens too many times, depending on the species of the plant, some plants can tolerate overgrazing more than others. You may kill that plant. So short grazing periods are the key to minimizing that regrazing and that overgrazing. So what is regenerative or adaptive grazing? A lot of you may have heard of these terms. Maybe you're already doing it. Maybe you're very familiar. You may even have lots of experience with this. But on the left-hand side is what we'd call a continuous graze period. It's basically a big pasture with a water source, whatever, and livestock are put in there and they're pulled out at the end of the year. And as you can see in the bottom there, like manure distribution is not great. Typically close to the water source or the shade source is where the most grass is hit really hard. And then further away, you'll have grass that is not grazed very much or undergrazed, actually. And then you'll have a typical rotational grazing system where you might move one time a week, maybe one time a month. You are doing some movement, but you're still not getting the recovery period. You're still getting a lot of manure, unequal distribution of manure, and you may still have some undergrazing at the end, like further away from the water source. And then on the right-hand side, we have what we call adaptive grazing, which typically is defined as a move one time a day or maybe every couple of days. We move according to observation needs, goals, and objectives. So we vary what the livestock are doing in the paddock, sheep or goats, cattle, whatever, based on observations on the ground, recovery time of the plant, the moisture available, growing degree J's, etc. So it allows for a much longer recovery period for the paddocks. It allows for much better distribution of nutrients and fertility. It allows for much better utilization of the available forage, and trampling of higher stock density typically will allow trampling of the ungrazed forage down to the ground, which helps to feed the soil biology. So adaptive grazing allows for a lot of variability. None of us can really predict what the weather or the season's going to bring this year, or the rainfall, the temperature, frost freeze. You can't even predict on your farm. You have different topographies, you have different slopes. I was at a farm last week and we were standing on a south-facing slope and the grass was easily 4 inches ahead of anywhere else on the farm that we were, which just shows how much that slope, it was a pretty steep slope, south-facing slope. So it was getting really, really good sun exposure. So that was really just another observation of how across even your farm, if you don't have an adaptive grazing mindset, you could, you can take advantage of some of this stuff and really advance your grazing there. So your soils are going to even vary, your forages, cropping, your history, your vegetation, even social things like your labor, how much labor you have, quality of life that you want to have. You might have some health issues or emergencies come up. So adaptive grazing allows for variability to meet all the goals that you may have as a grazer. So a little terminology. Obviously, everybody knows what a pasture is. Paddock is a defined subunit of a pasture. Stock density is the pounds of livestock per acre. Sometimes we talk about it as animal unit, which is 1,000 pounds of livestock per acre too. Stocking rate is the demand for the forage. So this is the demand from the livestock of how much forage they need to sustain themselves on the landscape. And then carrying capacity is the supply of the forage that the landscape can produce. So the way I like to talk about these two things is the stocking rate is the horsepower in the engine. So how much horsepower that truck can put out, and the carrying capacity is the supply of the fuel of that engine. So how much fuel tank you have, how much ability do you have to fuel that engine and carry your load. Overstocking. Okay, this is related to the overgrazing somewhat, but it's where your demand exceeds your supply. So this is where your livestock have more demand for forage than the landscape is able to produce. And the landscape may be limited by a drought, it may be limited by nutrients, and most often what I've seen is it's a management issue, which it's awesome because that's something that's not too hard to fix. We can absolutely increase the carrying capacity of most of our pastures just with some good management techniques. So overgrazing, we talked about this already. It's when we stay too long or come back too soon. And the principle here is that short graze periods improve animal performance and pasture performance, I might add, and also match your stocking rate and carrying capacity. And the reason that I love this term adaptive grazing is because the carrying capacity and stocking rate vary so much, right? You take 100 ewes with, let's just say 150% lambing rate. How many pounds are those lambs gaining per day? How many pounds are they gaining per month? How many animal units are you adding? So if you don't think about things in terms of that and adjust how much forage they need, so that's just one example of where you really need to be adaptive in matching your stocking rate and carrying capacity to the landscape. So I like to say that our goal as a grazer is to mimic nature's template. You'll see, various herds of wild animals here. And if the closer we can get to matching what nature does with the wildlife here, the better we're going to be as a grazer and more profitable we're going to be, I might add too. So it's not a rigid fixed routine system. I love planning, but this adaptive grazing is not a prescription. It's very important. Adjustments need to be made based on the ground observations from the manager to changing conditions, and that's including drought. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some key things for that, but multiple goals may be addressed at the same time in the same paddock, meaning you can meet multiple goals for livestock perspective, the landscape perspective, and the grazer's needs for profitability or the business needs. A little bit on the impact of grazing. So I mentioned this earlier. So grassland or pasture health is maintained by occasional short-term acute disturbance, which is grazing, followed by adequate recovery. So grazing is necessary for good grassland health. It's a needed thing for these grass species. It is a disruption to the plants and soil. You can have either positive or negative disruptions. Continuous grazing, like we saw in that diagram a little bit earlier, that is a chronic and a very negative disruption to the soil and to the plants. And as a result of a lot of continuous graze situations, depending on the stocking rate, really, but you'll see a lot of species just disappear. And basically what you'll see on the landscape is reflective of the management that is maintained on the landscape by us. So adaptive and acute. So we like to say an acute disruption is a good thing. It's a positive thing for the landscape. Short-term acute grazing with adequate recovery is positive disruption, and that is the key. Adequate recovery is key to pasture productivity. I've seen this over and over again, how folks that are willing to stretch out their recovery periods 60, 70, even 80 to 100 days, depending on the time of year and what they're getting into as far as moisture, they see massive gains. It may not be immediate, but massive gains in their pasture productivity year after year. And they're able to just up their carrying capacity by a lot. So another little diagram, just kind of showing the root system, which we focus on what's going on above the ground a lot with how much plant material and grass is left, but pretty typical that you'll see the same thing reflected in the root system below the ground. So if you want to have a massive root system to get those nutrients and act as a base for the mycorrhizal fungi to operate, you really need to leave some plant above the ground. So you'll also see, I think it's Kansas State University did this study on the 100% of the roots will stop growing for 17 days thing. Not sure if there's been any more recent studies on that, but that's kind of a thing that grazers like to talk about, is if you take 90% of the plant, you're gonna really slow your root growth. Take half, leave half. Called leaves for a reason. You're supposed to leave some. So it's something just to keep in mind. Leave some solar panel. That's really the solar panel that's driving that whole economy underground for the mycorrhizal fungi. Like I mentioned earlier, the biology really, which is part of that biological community. Okay, just another one kind of talking about post-grazing stumble and your root response. And I'm going to talk a little bit about grazing the best, trample the rest. So we talked about how carbon feeds the soil cycle, but typically the best part of the grass plant is that top part anyhow. So your protein, your digestible carbs are in that top half. The more undigestible things are in the lower, more lignin in the lower part of the plant. Don't forget your underground livestock. So I changed these numbers. Dr. Chris Nichols talks about it in terms of cattle for ranching audiences, but for cattle ranchers, but I changed it to the equivalent in sheep. So the average sheep, there's 12 sheep worth of microbes in every acre of soil. And she would say the top 6 inches of that soil is where 90 to 100%, 80 to 90% of your biology is found. It can be up to 60 sheep worth of healthy soil biology. Dr. Chris Nichols, fascinating soil scientist. If you ever want to look her up on YouTube, there's some really good stuff that she's done. But here's some examples of trampling some of that tall forage using high stock density grazing to feed those underground biological communities. Here's another example, and you'll have to pardon me again. This is done with cattle. This is one of my clients. This is done with cattle, so not with sheep, but I want to use this picture just to illustrate. Look at all that soil armor and the carbon that's being laid down, and then also notice the maturity of that grass on the right-hand side. So that's a really good way to utilize some of that more mature grass. It can be done with sheep. I'm going to show you some pictures here, what I've done with sheep over the years. And you can't really see the cattle in this picture, but they were in like excellent condition. So it did not really negatively affect the performance of the animals in this situation. This is a couple days back. You can see the cattle there in the top of in the middle of the picture, but this is a couple days prior paddocks. You can already see the regrowth happening through that mat of carbon. So just that's some really good example of some good grazing done and some good carbon laid down and some good armor on the soil surface. Lots of moisture retention going to happen there when we get the next rainstorm. So this is an example with sheep. This is a flock that I managed. You can see I'm doing the same thing, and it could be done with goats as well. Just sheep is what we had in this scenario. Long, skinny paddocks will give you more trample. Circular, more square paddocks are going to give you better utilization for grazing. So this was some more vegetative forage. It's some more mature stuff, but you can see it's a little more green and vegetative. This next picture is a little bit more mature forage. This is more like first cutting hay. I think this was June or probably July timeframe. You can see how long and skinny the paddocks are. Up here at the top in the next picture, you'll see a better example of it, but that is where they were for the night. I moved them in the afternoon up there, and then I opened a break, and then I got this section where they are right now for the morning. And while sheep aren't going to trample quite the same as cattle because they aren't as heavy, you can still do some of the same stuff. So you can see just how wide this strip was. And then you can also see here on the right-hand side, there's the net I used to cut it in half to break it up a little bit more to get a little higher stock density. Here's another example of doing some more high stock density grazing with sheep. And one of the keys I want to make sure I point out here is, yes, this high stock density grazing is good for building soil health, but also realize that the more forage on the ground, the more armor. You're breaking up raindrops, you're keeping more moisture in the soil. So when you have times of drought or dry conditions, it's really important, in my opinion, to err on the side of having more mature forage and taller forage, just from a moisture retention standpoint. You're going to grow more forage, you're going to be able to graze longer if you err on that side rather than taking it down or having more short forage. That's just another picture of essentially doing the same thing. They were taking care of an edge of a hayfield that we couldn't cut with the hay mower. So they got to take care of some of that burdock for us too. A little bit on soil organic matter. I think for every % increase in organic matter, it's another acre inch of water, so 20,000 gallons. So just to kind of like reinforce this whole idea of building that carbon, building the organic matter with some of this high stock density grazing and laying some of that carbon down. And I like to think about it as making an investment. So you're putting carbon into the bank, you're putting it into the economy of the soil, and you're going to get that payback in water retention and holding capacity. I mean, just 1% increase, which isn't all that hard to do in some, depending on where your soil is and your climate and all that, but that's not that incredibly difficult to do. Obviously easier when you start with a lower percentage of organic matter than starting at the higher end, but this is very doable. Jim Garrish likes to say 1 inch of effective rainfall. And the reason I say effective rainfall is as opposed to rainfall that hits the soil surface and starts running off. So an effective rainfall is an inch of rain that actually infiltrates into the soil, can grow as much as 500 pounds of forage per acre. I think that's a pretty massive amount of forage for us. I would definitely be going after that myself, make every acre count. So this is a slide. I have to give credit. I got this from Gabe Brown. He was nice enough to let me have this slide, but this shows just the power of some of this multiple move per day, putting carbon. So it's probably not too hard to figure out which soil you'd rather have. I'd rather have the one on the left. Interestingly enough, this is the same field, same cover crop mix that they were grazing. This was up in Manitoba. The one on the right was cattle were moved every 2 days. The one on the left, the cattle were moved multiple daily moves. And I think what you see as far as color is just the massive amount of carbon that was injected into the soil, just by extra carbon and the trampling of the cattle. So it's a massive and powerful way to to build resilience in your soils and allow yourself to harvest and hold more of that rain that falls, which is really what we need to be doing. Let's talk a little bit about recovery. I've been kind of poking around at this recovery idea. So what is recovery? So recovery depends upon a couple of things. Weather, the intensity of the grazing event. So if we leave, a good 6 to 8 inches of leaf out there, chances are we can come back much, much sooner to that paddock, depending on the moisture and a lot of other factors, than if we take it, we're really, really hard and we take it right down and we don't leave a lot of litter or a lot of plant leaf. So density, stock density matters. The health and size of the plant root system. So how healthy is the pasture before you start? In a very unhealthy pasture in a continuous graze situation, or if you're just starting out on a piece of land that hasn't had a lot of this management applied to it, you probably don't want to be coming back too soon. Build in some margin for error there. Really give yourself a buffer. Time of year. So obviously you can come back to a pasture much, much sooner in May and June when things are growing like crazy than you can in August or September. So time of year, growing degree days makes a big deal too. Plant composition and pasture. This is a very big topic. I can't really do it justice tonight, but just the plant species in your pasture are going to dictate when you want to come back. So that's a very complex topic. I can't really dive into that, but that does play a big deal of role, whether you're grazing warm seasons, whether you're grazing cool seasons, whether you're grazing a mix. Yeah, so how many legumes, all that kind of stuff. And then what your goals are. Are you wanting to let some of this stuff go back to seed, which I think is healthy every so often? It's a good way to reseed your pastures and get some more mature forage trampled down. So lots of different things you could talk about there. Again, your goals too. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to allow some species to really take off and grow and suppress some others? Are you trying to maintain more of a warm season pasture versus a cool season? Lots we could talk about there. I would just like to encourage everyone to avoid determining your recovery periods based on the calendar or a set schedule. So focus on plant recovery. Adaptive, boots on the ground, looking down, get out there and take a look. So when has a plant recovered, or when should I try to graze? And so I think this is some, remember which species of grass this is, but the point is that there's a flag leaf coming out the top there. So if you could pick a sweet spot for grazing, it would be when that plant is getting ready to shoot out the flag leaf. So that's at the optimum nutrition for the leaves in the plant before that plant starts putting a lot of the sugars into seeds, which is you're basically taking those sugars, making starches, putting them into seeds. So you have a lot of nutrition in that plant. And also there's enough, there's a lot of biomass. There's a good balance of quality and quantity. So we like to say grazing sweet spot is right there. You can see, you also see the difference in the plant roots, massive root systems compared to the smaller root systems on the left-hand side. Just another graph talking about the balance of protein and all the different things in the plant, and where the red circle is if you could pick a target, which it's very difficult to get this right every single time, that would be where you'd want to kind of like that mid-maturity to late maturity if you can try to target that. So a little bit of practical knowledge here. You'll see here on the right-hand side, this is one of my grazing charts. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the grazing chart, essentially what it is you've got paddock numbers you can see there in the column up and down, and then over the top is the dates on the calendar. And so this is a paper version. I like a paper version because I'm pretty analog and I like putting it up on the wall and having it like right there for me to see. And so what you do is you basically fill in the little box that corresponds with the date that you grazed it and the paddock that you grazed. And so as you can see on the top, I think those were that was a group of bulls, and then blue for bulls. Yep, that's what that was. And then the green was the cow herd. And you can see, I think this was April. Yeah, this was April. So we were moving really fast. You can see we were flying through these paddocks because we were grazing spring flush and just keeping the cattle moving really, really quickly. So I like this because, and I like it from the perspective of recording past events rather than forecasting the future, because as we've already talked about, it's very difficult to know what's ahead as far as weather and grass availability. Although some of this record keeping will help you be able to get a pretty good feel for your pasture's ability and the carrying capacity and what your pastures can do. So I really like it because I can look at a glance and I can see how quick my recovery, like, is it 35 days? Am I at 45 days? And then I can kind of get some idea based on what I'm seeing in the pasture and then what I know as far as when the last time I grazed this. There's some digital ways you can do this. Pasture Map, Maya Graze work really well if you're into the technology. They're really, really good tools. You can also use them to record rainfall. I like to record mine on the grazing chart here too. Another thing that you can do without any of this is just take pictures on your phone. It's nice because your phone has date and timestamp, so it's really easy to be able to look back at the timing, and you can also look at the maturity on the quality of the forage at the same time. So I really like taking a lot of pictures. Talk a little bit about estimating forage volume. So this is just a general chart. Obviously, species are going to play a big role in what it is. And essentially, if you've ever seen a grazing stick, which is just basically a yardstick, and you could use a tape measure, what I like to do is you take this grazing stick or yardstick and you can slide it on the ground, at ground level through the grass, and then kind of get it all, parallel with the ground. And then you can stand above the stick and look down over it. And that's a good way to calculate your stand density. So if I can look down through the grass stand and I can see about only 10% of the stick, that means I have a stand density of 90%. And then so on and so forth, down. So if I see 50% of the stick, I probably have a stand density about 50 to 60%. So if you take the stand height, 10 inches, and then you take your stand density, there's an average of, if you got a 90% stand density at 10 inches, you got 300 dry matter inches per acre. So at 10 inches, 300 times 10 is 3,000 for the dry matter per acre, pounds of dry matter per acre. Or inch acres, I'm sorry. So you can use this to calculate approximate. Now keep in mind that obviously species and time of year and how much moisture contents in the grass is going to play a big difference in all this. But this is a good way to get started and help calibrate your grazer's eye. It's also a really good way I like to, when you're in a drought, you really need to be monitoring your forage inventory. How much do we have left? Like how many more days can we go without rain? How many days can we go before we really need to start feeding some hay or think about selling some animals or shipping some animals or something? So keeping an inventory of your grass is really good practice to have, even if you're not in a drought, but especially in a drought, just so you know where you stand. And it's crucial to monitor early and often. Don't wait till you're in a drought to start doing this. Do it before you're in a drought, and then you won't get caught unaware. So a couple strategies for when you're in a drought. Feeding during the summer months. I really like, if you're going to try to build up some pastures, I really like feeding in the summer months because if there's moisture present, your soil biology is active, which means they are actively working on breaking down that carbon, as opposed to the winter where you typically have to wait for spring for that to start to break down. You can use this as an opportunity to get some herd effect or some fertility on areas of the farm that need some impact. This is a picture I took of a client of mine. He was doing this with cattle, and I'm going to show you some examples of doing it with sheep. But essentially, he was just using a long, narrow strip, about a little bit more than the width of a round bale unrolled. And then he was just every couple days, he was moving them to a new strip so they could get off that. I really like to unroll hay in the summertime versus bale grazing, because my feeling is that you can get a lot more potential recovery if you do get a rain. Bale grazing typically takes a lot longer for the area to recover. And so I guess my thinking on it is you'll get some more potential recovery and grass growth off that site if you do get a rain, depending on the time of year, of course. But you may get some forage growth that year if you don't totally smother it with the bale grazing. So I kind of prefer to unroll hay if you can, if in the summer months, if you're doing this kind of a strategy. Also, the one thing is don't be in too big of a hurry to start grazing again. You get a rain and grass starts growing. It's typically, everybody wants to get back up and start grazing and get going again. But I would give yourself time. Remember your grass, especially depending on how severe of a drought it's been, it's been very, very stressed. So let the grass recover and give yourself some margin before you start grazing, and you'll end up having far more productivity than if you just jump right in as soon as you have some grass growth. So this is just an after picture of that same. You can see the green strips where he did get some rain, and you can see how nice that grass is coming in afterwards and what it looked like a couple weeks, about a month later. Okay, so this is kind of doing some similar things with some sheep. Disclaimer, this is actually early spring, so we're not in a drought at this point. what I was doing was targeting some areas with the sheep and feeding some hay. Some of these, you can see some scrubby areas to try to like use the sheep to trample out those thorns and briars, and they did a really good job. Here's another picture of the same thing and the amount of fertility we left behind. We grew some nice grass in that area that summer, just using the animal impact from the sheep. You can do the same thing in a drought, pen them up in a small area to try to limit the impact across your whole farm. Use the opportunity if you need to feed some hay, get some impact out there, build some soil health and some fertility before you start grazing again when you get out of a drought. So destocking. I think this is something it's really a hard conversation to have with some folks. But it doesn't mean that you have to sell. But at some point, if you're in a severe enough drought, you really need to be prepared to move animals somewhere. Whether you're going to try to buy your way out of the drought with hay, which it's possible. I don't really suggest it all the time. You can get in a financial upside down really quickly trying to do that. Livestock can migrate with wheels under them. So it doesn't mean you have to sell. You can find someone who has forage for them to graze and have them custom grazed or taken care of by someone else. I think there's the positive lining of a drought is it does force your best genetics to the top. Think of a hard winter, which we didn't have here in Minnesota this last year, but if you have a hard winter on the wildlife populations, it really does force the weaker and the less, just not the great wildlife genetics to the top. And that's kind of nature's way of culling, is having a hard winter. But same thing for your animals. You can use drought to really see which ones are doing the best and also take the opportunity to keep your best and also sell the rest. Just sell the ones that aren't maybe they've been on the list to get rid of for a while, but the drought is a good excuse and a good way to force you to actually take some action and do it. And I was talking with someone recently about this concept of your best future herd or flock might only be a drought away. And it's something they observed after going through a drought is when they started culling hard in a couple of years, they realized, wow, my herd is so much better. And it really came back to the drought because the drought forced them to really get rid of some animals they'd been meaning to, but well, I have enough grass, so I don't really need to. This is the positive side of a drought. If you can look at it that way, is it really forces you to make some decisions that could be long-term, really good decisions for your farm. So some tips for strategic destocking is have your flock or your herd divided into your A, B, and C flocks, with A being your absolute keepers, C being the first to go, and B being kind of right in the middle. I think identify some critical rain dates. So this is going to be very kind of adaptive to your context. And, it's if you're measuring your forage inventory and you know how much grass you have left, you'll know like I need X amount of rain before this date, or we're going to be, having to move to the next thing. So, you can have a critical rain date and when the C flock has to go. These are the first animals to go off the farm. Second critical rain date I think is good to have. This is part of drought planning. You can have some of these things on the calendar as a what if. I say we're really dry in May. And our rain date might be June 15th. Our second rain date might be July 15th. So having some of these thought out ahead of time is really, I think, a good part of that planning process. So yeah, you can then have your B flock continue monitoring that forage recovery and inventory and get your remaining livestock on hay or stop grazing before you damage your pastures. And as we talked about earlier, you're going to be doing damage once you start really opening up the soil to direct exposure to the sun, and if you don't have any armor on that soil. So you're going to lose that moisture and really, really damage. And your recovery period, once you do get rain, will be so much longer than if you just pull them off early. Most people I've run into, they don't stop grazing soon enough. So Bud Williams said, you'll never grow broke having too much money or too much grass, but going broke is easy if you have too many livestock at the wrong time. That's especially true in drought. Most experts will tell you you can't really feed your way out of a drought. I think it depends. I'll just leave it at that. I think you can, but it also depends on your personal context and what your operational goals are as well. So quickly on profitability in a drought. This is a tactic I think some ranchers out west have taken advantage of. Is the one thing that's in short supply in a drought is forage. If you're in a severe enough drought, people will start selling and prices typically will come down as lots of animals hit the market. If you are proactive in your management, you sell early before everybody else in the neighborhood realizes they're in a drought, you're going to sell your livestock into a market that before it tanks. And So you're not going to have a double whammy of having to get rid of your animals and sell them into a depressed market because it's flooded with livestock from everybody else's, droughted areas. When the rains do come, if you've been a really good grass manager, you can typically buy back animals at much lower prices than what other folks are able to do, or you can custom graze for someone else. If you have some forage, you can now command a premium for your grass, custom grazing for someone else. So just some thoughts about some ways you can be profitable. Here's a couple other things I like to remind people of is some other tactics to drought proof your farm. So hay insurance. So we all typically have, liability insurance on just about everything these days. But how many of us have a hay insurance policy? And this is not your winter feed supply, okay? This is separate. How many of you have a stack of hay? And I know I just mentioned earlier that it's not wise to try to feed yourself out of a drought. And that's not what this is. This is just an insurance policy. This buys you a little bit of time to be able to make good decisions. Maybe you can, by waiting a week, you can sell livestock or move livestock into a better situation, getting a better price for your animals. It's a nice insurance policy if you don't have to just pull the trigger and liquidate tomorrow. So I like to suggest just have some extra hay on hand. Buy when the market is down and try to keep it covered. Not like the round bales on the right-hand side. That's not a good example of hay storage. But yeah, keep your hay covered, and have a little insurance policy there is really helpful. Grazing crop residue. You can absolutely, I know cattle are typically thought of as corn stalk grazers, but there's really no reason we can't do some of this with sheep and goats. Build relationships with neighbors if you have neighbors that are cropping and have some corn stalks or some small grain residue or whatever you have. Maybe there's an opportunity to graze some of that stuff and get a couple more weeks of grazing versus feeding hay. Ponds. So it's probably not thought of as a drought policy, but I love ponds for the diversity it brings to the landscape, and just the having all that water on hand is awesome. And one thing about ponds is, if you think about it, it's a giant reservoir of water that's constantly being wicked up by the soil. And so it also allows you the opportunity to maybe do some irrigation. It's catching and holding water, basically slowing water down from getting to, a river eventually. So it holds more water on your landscape. And obviously, everybody who's been around a pond always notices that the pond dam and the areas around the pond dam have more grass in a drought than the non-areas. So I think ponds are a really good thing for drought. And the Australian PA Yeomans said that every farm should be 8% water. And he's probably right. In his book, Water for Every Farm, which is a great read if you ever get a chance and want one on water. So yeah, if you could have your farm be 8% water, you'd be pretty drought proof. The other thing I like to say is wind breaks. Slow the wind velocity down. Wind, both in the wintertime, is brutal, but also the summertime, when you get these hot, dry winds, you're going to lose a lot of moisture if you can't slow that wind down. So plant some wind breaks. So a few closing thoughts, and then we'll take some questions here. Soil health is an investment that will pay off in many different ways. Think about it as putting an investment in the bank account, except it's the bank account of the soil economy. Carbon's the currency, biology is the economy. So we got to feed that economy the currency. If you can get away from a mindset of having to, extract every blade of grass from your pasture and leave some for the microbes and build that soil health, it's going to pay off massively in resilience. I think a lot of our success or lack of success in a drought situation is from our preparedness, our ability to act and take action on our plan, and our attitude towards the drought. It's going to come. It's kind of one of those inevitable things in agriculture, and how well we prepare, and then our attitude. If we can find those silver linings in the genetics, the culling, and the silver linings of selling early and having an opportunity to buy back lower priced livestock, that can really affect your profitability and your bottom line. And lastly, leverage a drought situation to make you a better grazer and business owner. There's nothing like a hard time in a farmer ranch to make you a better grazer, livestock manager, business owner. Leverage those hard times, and it will massively pay off. Just quickly before I end here, I want to recommend a couple resources. So the two books on the left side, The Drought Resilient Farm and Managing Pasture, both by Dale Strickler. He actually spoke at SFA's Midwest Soil Health Summit back in March. Fabulous author, really, really good resources. that middle book is probably one of my favorite books on pasture management. Just a fantastic book. Highly recommend. And then the Soil Owner's Manual, a short but very sweet and succinct book on soil, just going over some of what I talked about tonight and then far, far more. So highly recommend that if you get a chance and want to do some more reading on soil. And lastly, a little bit, I talked about at the beginning, I work for Sustainable Farming Association. We're known as the Farmer to Farmer Network here in Minnesota, founded in 1988 by farmers focused on improving soil health, growing healthy food, and revitalizing rural communities. So I'm sure that many of you are members and are familiar with SFA, and I know that a lot of you have been to our events. So yeah, if you want to learn more about SFA, feel free to jump on the website there, sfa-mn.org, learn more about us and what we do. Questions? I will wrap it up there, and I'd be more than happy to take some questions. I think we got enough time.
Outstanding, Jonathan. Appreciate your insight there and representing your team at the Sustainable Farming, and really appreciate everything that you put together. I thought that was extraordinarily comprehensive. And so you went over a whole bunch and you did inspire some. I'm going to give you just a little bit of a chance to catch your breath, Jonathan, because I'm going to task the first question to my colleague, Troy Salzer. Troy's on here, and then you can follow up on that one, because when I think of this, and the question that came in the chat was, what is the ring test, or evaluating, kind of quantities of the forage, but also then we have our forage stick. And again, there's not particularly a picture of those, but I know Troy works a whole bunch in terms of grazing management and just forage allocation. And so Troy, we got the good one for you here, to at least to round it out. Jonathan could have said, please contact your local University of Minnesota extension agent. And so I am, and I'm going to pose that question to Troy. Tag, you're it.
Thanks, Travis. I really appreciate it. And I know Jonathan would have been able to handle this just fine. But generally speaking, what we like to do in relationship to evaluating forage yields out in the pastures is to actually utilize a ring test, where we'll go ahead and throw a ring or a square of a certain size and actually work that down to the soil level, and having the grass inside or outside, and then actually clipping that, weighing it, and determine the actual yield that you can expect per acre. In that process of doing that, it's on a as-fed basis, and we can do some conversions that way. But with utilizing both the ring test as well as utilizing that analysis process with a stick to determine what the yield per acre is, it really gives you an idea of how much forage there is in front of you. And also, if you do it frequently enough throughout the grazing season, it gives you a chance to identify how much additional growth is occurring on a daily basis. That will vary dramatically, especially in drought times, like Jonathan had suggested. And so therefore, giving yourself the opportunity to understand what that growth wedge is like ahead of the livestock really helps you in determining when to destock if necessary. Jonathan, other things?
No, that's great. And that is the I should say probably the right way to do it. If you have a ring and you take the time to clip it and do all that, that's going to give you the most accurate, absolutely the most accurate measure of how much forage. And then I think correlating, like you said, I didn't really go into this because it's can get pretty technical, but correlating that with up against a metric of how much rainfall you're getting can kind of give you an indicator of when you're getting into trouble, like you mentioned. So yeah, that's a really good way to do that.
I don't know if any of the panelists here have utilized this, but I've utilized actually both a homemade Excel spreadsheet to go into that analysis, and there are some actual forage growth models that you can subscribe to help me in calculating that, especially when you start to get a larger herd or flock in relationship to identifying how that growth pattern is. And especially as we get into these unique type of forages like cover crops, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say I've seen that style used a little bit more on much larger ranches where you've got, far more animal units, and where literally like a couple of days worth of forage can make a big difference as far as the amount of hay you have to buy in and timing of destocking, et cetera. So that's where I've seen it. And out west where you have a lot less rain. So you really, most of your grass growth is set by like June 1st for the year. You kind of have a good indicator, or July 1st, of what you're going to have for the rest of the year. So, but really good things to be thinking about, even for smaller producers, to manage that high of a level for sure.
Thanks, team. All right, I'm going to pull some things together, Jonathan. And so much of what we do from a grazing management standpoint, and again, drought, or truthfully, even those across the country that join us that may not have to deal with it at the same level. But when today's webinar is April 29, 2024, and so we'll just call it May 1, at least, or will be soon. But when we kind of think of that, a couple things come to mind, and again, this is across species, from beef cattle to sheep and goats, is that even if you had cattle that have their calves and can go out, or obviously from this standpoint, both sheep and goats that the families have been put together, is that you're often tempted, right, to say, you know what, we're in a dry lot right there and it's green over there, and in fact it might not be us as producers that are tempted, it might be the animals, right, that see the greener grass on the other side of the fence. And so that's a tougher decision. But first off, I guess in terms of managing that, you did a great job of identifying where we could be in terms of early and kind of mid maturation of the plants. But the question that came from our colleagues and attendees here was, can you describe just a little bit more in terms of what the flag leaf is? Okay, and so we want to know when we can take them out, because of the, at least on this upcoming May, the grass is greener on the other side. Okay, but once we get there, knowing when we could or should move it from paddock to paddock or grazing spot. So just a little bit, or if you wanted to go back to that slide and show just a little bit more on kind of our flag leaf, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, let me see if I can hop back to it. But I think, let's see here. What basically, very basic understanding, it's the last leaf that comes out of the plant before the seed head. Here we go. The seed head emerges. So obviously varies depending on species, but you'll typically see it look like that, just kind of straight up. And then if you actually, depending on how advanced that flag leaf stage is, you can actually kind of snap that off and open up, uncover that, and you should be able to see the seed head. Again, depending on the species and what you're looking at, but generally that's what it will look like, is like a pointy leaf that's sticking straight up is that flag leaf stage. And again, that's a target. I'm not saying if you don't graze there, that's not, it's very difficult as a grazer. I'm speaking from experience doing it in a couple different climates too. It's very difficult to time your grazing always be at one time. But if you could pick a point on a map to try to target, that would be what I would try to shoot for. So
outstanding. Okay, we're going to shift. Appreciate that. Troy, do you have anything to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, one other thing I would suggest is make sure you realize that certain species will only produce that that seed head once per year, and so if you have those species, realize that, and even if you let it graze or grow for a long period, it won't ever produce another flag leaf or seed head throughout the season.
Yes, that's a very good point, Troy. That's something I should probably add to my presentation, is if you've already taken that first cutting or depending on the species, you won't get any more flag leaves. So yeah, very good point, Troy. Yep.
All right, thanks, Jonathan and Troy. We're rocking it through it now. That one was timing, at least on providing them into the grasses. My next question is timing in relation to moving them from their particular grasses. All right, and so I guess how I'm going to design this question is that if you put the sheep and goats in a specific prescribed area, they're gonna choose the grasses or again forbs or browse, obviously from a goat standpoint of the things that they prefer most. Now they're going to leave some, and so some of our producers in fact may manage behind that and mow that behind it or whatever that may be. And in fact, I'm going to combine this question, Jonathan, with at least the term that was put into the chat there on total grazing, which to the best of my knowledge is digging a little deeper, saying, okay, you were selective initially, but now we're going to provide you and say, nope, you got to keep going. And there's some positives or negatives on that. So sorry if that's a two-part question.
Sure.
But the first part, again, trying to see what we can do on the selective grazing, if there's anything from that standpoint, and then moving on from a little bit farther. Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to answer the total grazing question first, actually, if that's okay. So my understanding of total grazing is it's ultra high density mob grazing, whatever terms you want to use. Essentially, the idea is you're removing basically every bit of leaf, and you're either trampling it or consuming it. And so I'm basing this off of what I have seen. I've never done it myself. I have some concerns about it. I think it's very dependent on the context. I think there's some climates where it works, where it was kind of developed and it works really well. And I think there's certain species of grass in those climates where it can work really well with. Based on what we have here in Minnesota, I have some hesitations. I do know some people have done it and they're saying good things about it. But it's basically a very, very, very high density, and a big part of this is having very well adapted genetics to be able to have cattle or sheep or whatever to be able to hold up to a lot of pressure, I would say, to perform in this type of a situation. And the proponents of it will say that there's a massive increase in organic matter, humus in the soil, which, as we talked about earlier, is really from every time if you basically take all the leaf away from the soil, you're going to see the roots die off in similar proportions. Is my understanding of the studies done on that. So dying roots will add organic matter to the soil. I mean, that's part of the process. And when you do it at such a high rate, you will boost organic matter. So anyhow, I think that's kind of my understanding of total grazing. I'm not necessarily a proponent of it for my climate. I think it does work for some people. But again, this is coming from, I have never done it myself. I've done some high stock density grazing. I wouldn't call it total grazing. So then the second question was more on the clipping, and Travis, help me out here if I'm forgetting it now. So on clipping pastures, and then how selective to be. So I think that's where being really adaptive in your management comes. And then just in my opinion, depending on the life cycle of where you are at in the livestock. So in sheep, if you're around lambing time, if you're pasture lambing, if you got young lambs, I think being a little more on the selective side, it depends on your pasture, but being a little more on the selective side is okay. There's times the year maybe you can push them a little bit harder to try to be non-selective. Again, I think back to nature as the template, and there's definitely times where you'll see a whole bunch of wildlife all grouped together grazing, and then you'll see them all spread out at different times of the year. So that's not necessarily a rule to follow for a grazer, but I think it just depends on time of year. As far as clipping pastures go, I've spent days of my life on a brush hog clipping pastures, and so this is maybe a little bit more influenced by that experience than anything, but my observations have been that I don't think you gain. I think depends on what you're clipping and what your goals are. I have found for the people I've done it for, and it seems to be done more for aesthetics than actually function. In a sheep and goat operation, there may be a little bit more need, depending on the size of the operation, maybe more need for clipping than in cattle. I find that with the cattle, you can pretty much do with the livestock what you do. If you're able to do the management and move multiple times a day, you can get a lot of that trampling done. So I guess I'm not a big proponent of the clipping. I think there's a minimal, and again, I think it's very context driven, but I think you get the amount of return on investment in the time and the equipment and the, to clip is not, in my opinion, really pay off. I'd be interested in what Troy thinks too, because he's ranching in this climate, but that's kind of been my experience, in multiple different places I've been. Travis, did I get that whole question answered?
You rocked it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yep.
And Troy was multitasking. Troy, are you fine with that? We can move on, or you got?
The only thing I would say is in relationship to the total or very high, ultra high stocking density, you really need to build in a lot more time for recovery, because by doing that, in essence, you are basically pinching off all of the grass stalks. So it has to completely recover from the root like it's growing for the first time. And therefore, it just takes a lot longer to make that recovery. But with that in mind, the uniformity of grazing, the stomping of weeds, all of those things can be very beneficial in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, recovery, if you're going to take more, you have to budget more time for recovery. I have just run into a lot of people who have gone into a ultra high stock density grazing situation, just kind of jumped right in 2 feet first, and they've had a wreck. Part of it's because the genetics were not adapted. So if you're going to go that route, take it slow and go as much as you can risk as far as conception and breed back and different things like that. But yeah, just I'd be careful and give your plants your forage the time it needs to recover.
Yeah, and we need some nutrients, like you said, on the breed back one. Okay, I mean, today's is about grazing, but productive animals in our system are what helps to pay the bills as well. So Troy put in an answer in our chat, and I'm just gonna touch on that one because the inquiry was best warm season grasses for Minnesota. And so what was put in here was reed canary grass, meadow brome, meadow fescue, and tall fescue. And again, Jonathan, I'm gonna ask on that one, and we'll kind of pull a few more together and just finish up our day. But do you envision, are there some of these that we could plant or overseed or kind of help out from that standpoint in terms of the ranges or forage, just from pasture management on a proactive standpoint, if there is ample moisture in the soil?
Yeah, I would say it depends on what's already present. Typically, overseeding can be, if there's already existing grass species present, can be very difficult to do. Most people I find to do it well, they're basically starting from scratch. I've done a fair amount of overseeding, and it just, some of it was annuals, some of it with some perennials, but I have found it's very difficult to get stuff to compete against. Most of it's just due to nitrogen tie-up. There's just not enough fertility for these little guys to get going. So, yeah, I know there's some people that'll sprinkle in some warm season grasses and just trying to see what happens, and they'll have some luck. I think it really depends on the timing of rain, timing of the grazing. There's a lot of different things that could play into it working well. Yeah, I feel like my answer as far as Troy put some good stuff in the chat as far as some good species. I'm a big fan. I was in Oklahoma for many years. I love tall fescue. I know some people really love to hate fescue. I think it's one of those grasses that you can make more money on fescue. And I know some people will roll their eyes at this, but you can make more money on fescue, in my opinion, than a lot of the other grasses, just because the palatability going into the winter. To me, in my grazing operation, I don't care as much about what thrives in May, June, because everything's thriving in May and June typically. What I want is something I can graze as long into the winter as possible, and fescue typically does that for me. Now, you do want to watch on, toxicity, and, if you're going to plant something, definitely plant something that's either novel endophyte or endophyte free. But yeah, I think from a profitability standpoint, fescue has a lot to add to the conversation. And everything else there are really good suggestions as well. But palatability of fescue going into the winter is almost unsurpassed in my experience, unless I'm missing something. So
right. What about just a quick transition to more so on goats? And in fact, they brought some of, even from the thoughts of browsing, or they said tree hay, of seeing what are your thoughts in terms of either grasses that the goats like just a little bit more, or kind of can be used?
right. Yeah, I would say, in general, goats are gonna gravitate towards the brush and the browse. That's just what they love. As far as grasses though, when I was grazing goats as a teenager, they seem to eat just about everything, but they do like the broadleaves and the forbs better, when you're watching them graze. So they are gonna tend towards the brush. And if you can, have some brush and trees, that's the best. But I think from my experience with goats, they're pretty adaptable. If all you have is some grass, they'll be okay. Um, I don't have any real experience with tree hay. I do think there's just a lot to be said for planting some of these fast, improved growing species of trees, like as fodder sources. I know like the honey locust, I think, is one that people do, and they drop the pods, and livestock seem to love them. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, that I think is starting to gain some traction in some circles. So I'm excited to see that. But I don't, as far as the tree hay idea, I don't have a ton of experience with that myself.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to grab just a little bit there. And I think that this is just a resources and time management, Jonathan and our team. When the inquiry becomes truthfully shade and or water accessibility. And so I think, at least in my mind, and you guys can provide some summation to it as well, is that I think the animals can certainly survive with or without some of the shade, because sometimes that's available, and sometimes it's not. But if we can have that, then that provides, the cooler place during the middle of the day, but also knowing that we have a water source that is accessible and identifying that. So I would just challenge you guys with that quick question in terms of maybe what are the quick things to keep into consideration as we regenerative graze, or make some of those decisions a little bit quicker.
Yeah, so I didn't have a picture of this in this presentation. The one I did, I think it was back in November, on more of the grazing infrastructure. I talked a little bit about shade. I think I showed a picture of a couple different portable shade options. So shade, I think shade is important. Everybody loves shade, but I also will say, even in some very, very hot climates, hair sheep, you got to think about like where some of these, now they're more nativized, or not nativized, but they're more acclimated to our climate here. But a lot of these things came from very, very, very hot. A lot of these species, hair sheep and some of the goat breeds came from Africa. And so they're very, very used to the heat. And, even on 110-degree days in Oklahoma, sheep would be out in the middle of the day grazing, just didn't even bother them. Yeah, sometimes, if they had access to a tree, they would definitely shade up for a bit. But so I think it's something important to offer them. And if they're acclimated to, let's say I'm coming from Minnesota, if they're acclimated and used to a Minnesota climate, they're probably going to suffer a little bit when they get, pretty hot. So I think having that shade, trees are awesome. The portable shade shelters that you can build or you can buy are also great. One of the things I love about these shade shelters is that you can position them right in the pasture where you want to put some fertility. So you can, if you have like some brushy areas, or you have some like brambles, you can put the shade thing right close by and let them add some fertility, try to like get some more grass growing. So that's one of the things I love about shade. And I hope that answers the question, but I think it's important.
Yeah, that's right on.
I wouldn't stress about shade, especially for sheep and goats, but I think I will say too, like if you're in a very public space, folks that don't understand livestock as much, if they don't see that you have all these things, I definitely recommend covering your bases as far as having that. There's just been a lot more, animal cruelty type things going on, and especially with social media. So I would say definitely cover your bases on that and make sure you have what your livestock need.
Absolutely.
Also,
thank you, Jonathan. Yep.
I'm just looking at the chat too. I'm sorry. Wool sheep are very different than hair sheep. So wool sheep are going to be much hotter. So I'm sorry, I should have said that earlier. Wool sheep are going to be much hotter depending on when you shear than your hair sheep. So if you've got wool sheep, yes, you're going to want to definitely have some shade.
Okay, one of my last questions here, and I appreciate everybody for hanging on for our talented presenters and our team, is identified at bale grazing. In fact, I would just kind of describe this, as strange as this is, as almost emergency-esque, right? And so Jonathan talked about that we had to make decisions on destocking of our animals, and certainly when it comes to that, we want to make those decisions and identify which ones are the best ones. But one kind of an intermediary answer could potentially be the bale grazing, because either we have access or can put those out there to supplement it so that maybe we don't graze as hard in a specific corner or a specific area of the pasture and allow the regrowth. And so that's my main question here as we kind of close things out, and then we'll talk just a little bit about some of the upcoming things that we've got going on. And so it's designed as bale grazing, but maybe I'm just going to call this intermediary to the emergency. Okay, so go ahead.
Sure.
I'm going to let Troy attack this one first, and then Jonathan,
Sure.
you can give the follow-up.
Good.
So there are several opportunities that I see during the season that bale grazing can really positively contribute to the management due to a nutrition standpoint on your livestock, as well as stretching your pastures, especially those that typically run short of pasture throughout the season. And utilizing stored feeds early in the season allows that growth to occur in your forage supply, your grasses out there. And so supplementing, especially when it's extremely wet forage, will help to extend that supply. For those of you that have relatively small flocks or herds where they come in down an alley, it works out fantastic to supply a centralized location for those bales. You don't get quite the benefit out in your pastures themselves. And Jonathan's approach to unrolling entire bales or portions of bales on a daily or few day basis really does address some of that. And so that does work out well, especially if you can strategically put it where nutrients are needed out in your pastures. So with that in mind, that works well. Other options would be to utilize large square bales where you can flake off some of the material, or small square bales, giving you a lot more flexibility in how much you provide and the ease at which you provide it to the livestock. It's like kids in a candy store. If they can't have it and you give it to them when they're on pasture, they tend to come over and pick it apart and consume a bit of it. Other thoughts, Jonathan or Sabrina?
Jonathan, you're on mute there, quick.
Yeah, thank you. So I think as far as like I think the question was on like the summer bale grazing. So I just gonna differentiate. So like when I say bale grazing, I'm thinking of like pre-placed bales on a paddock, and then you just strategically allow access to a certain number of bales or a bale, and then you let them use it up and then expose to the next bale. And in this climate, it's done a lot in the wintertime because we have free concrete with frozen ground. And so it makes sense. You can go out there in November and place all the bales you need for the winter, or most of them. And then you just have to walk out and, move a wire or open a gate or whatever. So when I'm talking about unrolling hay, I'm talking about actually taking a bale, or if it's a square bale, flaking off what you need. And if you unroll the hay, you're spreading that same bale out across so many more square feet. So you're allowing more access for livestock. You're also letting whatever's left behind is typically thinner as far as the residue. So it covers more area, but the residue isn't as thick. So grass can come through a little quicker. So in my experiences, I kind of like doing that in the summertime because if I bale graze, I'm putting a pretty thick residue layer down. Chances are that residue is not going to decompose and allow for any grass growth in that area in the same year. Whereas bale or unrolling the hay will allow for some grass growth potentially that year. So if I'm trying to, scrape together every blade of grass I can, I'm in a drought situation, I'm going to lean towards unrolling the hay to allow some recovery of that area yet this year. And then I might only stay on that one area, maybe depending on the size of the herd or the flock, 3 or 4 days and move them on to the next area so that we don't hit it too hard. I mean, it's going to be stressed, but hopefully we get some rain. And so I think that's what those couple slides I showed, hopefully showed that bale unrolling method, which I think works really well in a drought situation. So yeah.
Thank you kindly, Jonathan and Troy, for team attacking those. I'm going to again reintroduce Sabrina. She's going to give our heads up of our next event, and then also then Brenda will close us out. And so thanks for joining us. Sabrina, what do we got going on for our next function?
Yeah, hi everyone. We ask you to join us next month, May 30th, at the same time, 7:30 p.m. We will be talking about strategies for buckthorn control. So there's lots of interest in utilizing goats for invasive species control, and buckthorn is one of the major species of or problematic species in our area in the upper Midwest. And we have a number of researchers at the University of Minnesota who have worked with goats and browsing to control buckthorn, as well as other strategies for keeping buckthorn at bay after you have browsed with goats. So we hope you'll join us next about a month from now, and stay tuned to hear our research updates.
Thank you, Sabrina. I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to learn and listen. And we really appreciate you, Jonathan. I thought this was fantastic. I learned a lot. It was really interesting, a lot of science, a lot of biology, and a lot of really useful hands-on things that everybody can use. So thanks again, Jonathan. And we hope that you guys all join us again next month for our webinar, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted hopefully within about a week or so. So thanks again, and I hope you all have a great week.
Welcome.